The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, as the case might be, to everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining me this morning to review the Marathon Technologies product portfolio. My name is Bob Boule. I'm the Director of Product Management here with Marathon Technologies, and I'm going to be bringing you through today's session. I'm going to run about a half an hour and maybe a little less, and we'll leave some time for questions as well. Really, just a couple of agenda items to get out of the way. If you do have questions or you do want to pose a question to me, feel free to go ahead and type it directly into the GoToWebinar Q&A section or the questions section of the client, and I'll review those questions at the end. The other thing to keep in mind is if there are any questions that you happen to ask that I don't answer live on today's broadcast, I'll certainly follow up with you directly to make sure we get you answers, no questions asked. The other piece is I am going to be recording this session as well. So if you miss any portion of it or a colleague wishes to see it, we'll be sending out an email with a direct link to our YouTube channel where this recording will be posted within 48 hours. And so we'll go ahead and get that information out. We'll also make the presentation material available to everybody via the partner portal. With that said, I want to go ahead and jump right into today's presentation. And really start off with a detailed description of the Marathon Technologies product portfolio. And I know that some of you have been working with Marathon for quite some time and sort of have an understanding of what it is that we offer. But I wanted to go ahead and put this in context for the rest of today's presentation. Obviously, starting with Everrun MX Enterprise. Everrun MX is our core technology, our flagship product, and really is designed to provide fault tolerance and high availability for any Windows-based application. Now, with Everrun MX Enterprise, and what you may hear from time to time is MX Enterprise or Level 3 protection, sort of intermingled or used by folks here at Marathon. You'll hear that from time to time. And what that means is simply full system fault tolerance. So when you purchase MX Enterprise, you're getting full system fault tolerance. That includes a mirroring and complete redundancy of the disk, the system state, so that you can do everything, including walk up behind one of the servers and pull the plug out, and your Windows instance will simply continue to function. It's a zero downtime, zero data loss solution that offers a fully redundant, fully fault-tolerant solution while allowing your workloads to access multiple processor cores. So that's our, sort of top-end, sort of ultimate availability. Now, when you purchase Enterprise, you are also able to run protected virtual machines at both level 3 and at level 2. So it encompasses what you can do with Express. Now, moving down a little bit, we start talking about Everrun MX Express. Now, Everrun MX Express offers what we call component level fault tolerance. What that means is that if you were to have a network adapter fail, or if you were to have a RAID controller fail that was serving up your primary storage to your virtual machines, or some other disk failure, it would go ahead in an Express protected virtual machine or a level 2 protected virtual machine would compute through those component level failures. Now, system reboot potential is there in the event that you have a complete server failure. So if one of those servers were to fail completely, there's the potential for your virtual instance to have to, in an automated fashion, reboot on the second host. Now, that's the gap in protection, and we're going to talk about sort of the trade-offs that you make in terms of running something at level 3 or with Enterprise versus level 2 with Express. And then we have Everrun MX Extend. Now, Extend offers the local protection of Enterprise or Express. So you're going to be able to protect your workload using either level 2 or level 3 protection, so Enterprise or Express, but adds asynchronous replication for DR. So we're going to be able to replicate those workloads to a second site and basically go ahead in an asynchronous fashion and allow you to go ahead and get that data, get all the information that's inside of those protected virtual machines to a second site. And we're going to do that asynchronously. And that's a key point here as we talk about a little bit later in the presentation the differences between extend and split site. We want to make sure that everyone understands that there's a clear distinction between the two and sort of what those distinctions are. So if you think about extend, think about it in terms of disaster recovery and asynchronous replication. Then we move into Everrun split site. Now, split site allows you to take your configuration under either MX Enterprise or MX Express and actually separate those two servers. So without split site, you're looking at running these two MX hosts probably in the same rack or at least in the same data center where you've got direct connectivity. So you've got point-to-point connectivity for these two servers to act as the availability links and to do the synchronization. When you add the element of split site to a MX Enterprise or MX Express configuration, you're now able to go ahead and separate those servers. Now, as we'll talk about a little later in the presentation, that separation is really bandwidth dependent because we are talking about synchronous mirroring here with both of these products. However, the bandwidth and latency requirements are much different between Enterprise and Express. But if you think about this in the context of a use case, something along the lines of being able to separate servers on a campus or in an airport, to be able to put, server 1 of your MX Enterprise configuration in Terminal A and server 2 in Terminal C to go ahead and prevent any sort of macro level events from bringing your system down. Something like a cooling unit dies in a data center, or a sprinkler system or fire suppression system goes off, or a power outage. If you're able to separate those assets and ultimately spread that risk across two separate sets of infrastructure, that's what ultimately what split site is getting you. And then we look at Everrun Monitor, which is the most recent addition to the Marathon portfolio. What Everrun Monitor does is really adds, the monitoring aspect and the ability to sort of implement a proactive availability management plan to all of the products in the portfolio set. So if you think about Monitor as a sort of overlay for any of the products we've just talked about, it's going to go ahead and monitor the MX configuration, the split site elements, which include any kind of quorum services that are set up, the extend elements, which will extend out to monitoring the DR site if you so choose, and then ultimately get inside of all of your protected virtual machines and be looking at software, services, resource consumption, all of the things that you'll want to monitor, you'll want to be able to look at that could lead to an impending failure. And ultimately allow you to proactively manage those failures and actually go through those repair scenarios before they've had an opportunity to impact your production environment. And that's really where Everrun Monitor sort of fits into the portfolio. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, Everrun Monitor also fits in sort of as a standalone availability management solution. So if your customer is not in the market for or doesn't have the budget for a redundant solution, so they don't have the second server in the budget, they don't have the software expense or the hardware budget to run either an MX Enterprise or MX Express, we can certainly talk to them about at least monitoring any of those single points of failure that happen to exist in their environment. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as we get into some of the other elements of building a custom solution. And the reason we wanted to go through this with everybody is to really make sure everyone understood sort of the breadth of technologies that Marathon is able to offer. We're obviously best known for our multi-core, multi-processor, full system fault tolerance solution, Everrun MX. And of course, we're able to offer that zero downtime, zero data loss. We are first to market with the FTSMP, and ultimately being able to offer that ability to go ahead and have multi-processor, multi-core, fully fault-tolerant systems, running on top of our platform. However, we also acknowledge that, the highest level of protection can ultimately, bring in a higher level of cost. And we want to make sure that we're able to offer a set of solutions that balances the requirements for the customer with their budget and make sure that you, our partners, and our customers understand that we offer a full range of availability solutions. So as we look across here at Everrun MX, obviously that full system FT, zero downtime, zero data loss. Those are the real selling points to a customer. However, FTSMP is resource expensive. So you look at the overhead that's associated with being able to do full system protection. And if the customer has the budget to purchase the servers, we want to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward and offering them that flagship product. However, if the customer does not have the budget for the servers that are associated with running FTSMP and they're looking for a redundant solution that is more in line with the budget that they do have available, now we're looking at something like an MX Express. And obviously there will be a trade-off there in terms of the scenarios around potential failure for the solution with a lower total cost of ownership. Obviously the lower overhead and hardware costs that are associated with that are a direct trade-off of component level fault tolerance versus full system fault tolerance. And obviously the acceptance of risk in terms of a potential failover, an automated failover, but a potential failover, but at a much lower cost or a much lower total cost of ownership when we look at software and hardware costs. And then, as I'd mentioned earlier, if we get a customer that's looking at wanting to manage availability in their environment, they want to make sure that they understand when there's a problem. They want to be able to efficiently react to these problems. That's where Everrun Monitor comes into play as either an overlay to Everrun MX, Express, or Extend, or as a standalone proactive availability management tool. Now, obviously, it offers no workload protection because obviously if the customer decides to not go with a redundant solution, they'd be running on a single server. But it does offer the proactive nature of alerts and alarms on failure and the ability to really sort of maximize or really tighten up that recovery point objective by understanding and knowing about problems as they occur without having to wait for an issue to occur, or without having to respond to customer inquiries when something's failed. Everrun Monitor will put the customer out in front of those scenarios. And then, one of the things that we want to make sure all of our partners are asking is, does the customer require split site? So if they're running an MX or an Express implementation, have they considered the benefits of separating these assets? Have they considered the benefits of insulating themselves from that macro level event that may bring the system down, like a power outage, like the existence of a cooling unit that goes offline and ultimately forces systems to start shutting down in the data center? If both of your servers are in the same location, they're both subject to the same environmental impact. And if you separate those servers using something like split site, you even further reduce the ability of an environmental issue to bring down your system. And then lastly, does the customer have a DR requirement? If the customer has a DR requirement where they want to go ahead and get their critical information from a certain location, from the main location, and they want to asynchronously replicate that data, say to a DR site on the other side of the country, or 2 states over, or whatever the case might be, the Marathon Everrun MX Extend product will act as an overlay here and allow you to go ahead and implement either an MX or an MX Express implementation with DR added to that solution. Now, if we look at, and one of the things that we're very realistic about is, sort of the impact of budgets when it comes to looking at the availability solutions for a customer. And as you can see here, we start talking about, the sort of cost versus benefit, or the cost versus protection level of the various products in the portfolio set. And obviously, if we look at, the top right-hand corner there, we're looking at Everrun MX, and that offers full system fault tolerance. So this is really the best level of protection you can get. However, obviously, when you start pricing out the total cost of ownership, it's there. There's certainly a more expensive element to running Everrun MX. And then if you were to add a split site, extend, or monitoring piece, that even pushes up your protection level higher. So you've got more to help insulate yourself from downtime, but it also does bump up the cost. So that's something to consider as you sort of move down the chart here. As we move down to, sort of looking at Everrun MX Express, and again, Everrun MX Express is going to have lower software costs, lower hardware costs, um, but obviously that protection level, it's moving toward the left in terms of the protection level. So we are not getting as high a protection level as we get with Everrun MX. However, we still have the option of adding those availability add-ons in the form of Split Site, Extend, or Everrun Monitor to be able to go ahead and either add proactive availability management or add DR or add geographical or site-wide failure insulation from that particular to that particular solution. But we're giving up full system FT for component level fault tolerance, which I described earlier. So again, there's a solution there for our customers, whether it be at the MX Enterprise full system FT level down to the MX Express level. Both of these require a second server, but will offer full redundancy for the customer. Now, if the customer goes and indicates that a second server is simply not in that budget, then we move down to looking at how we can help them manage availability in a single server environment. So we're looking at something like Everrun Monitor. And what Everrun Monitor will do is if they've made a conscious decision to not go with a redundant server or redundant server protection, at least they can go ahead and implement a solution like Everrun Monitor. What Everrun Monitor will do is put them out in front of those either failure scenarios. So when a failure happens, they know about it first rather than hearing about it from a customer or an application owner or a stakeholder. They'll also be able to look at predictive elements within that environment and be able to sort of get out in front of any potential failure. So if you've got a disk on a RAID set that fails, if you've got a network card in a redundant network setup that fails, obviously you want to know about that. You want to be able to schedule the maintenance to be able to repair that. It will involve some downtime in a single server solution, but at least with Monitor, you're out in front of those failure scenarios and you're not reacting. You're taking proactive action as it relates to being able to really understand what's happening in that single server environment, if that's the choice that the customer makes, or if that's what the customer's budget simply dictates. So we wanted to make sure that we sort of looked at that spectrum of protection levels, that we were able to sort of put it in the context of looking at this from a sort of budget versus requirements perspective, and help you understand as a partner, as you're interfacing with the customer, that we've got a number of different options here that they can use from an availability solutions perspective, regardless of what their budget looks like, and obviously highly dependent on sort of what their requirements are from an availability perspective. Now, when we look at sort of what's driving costs around, the total cost of ownership around some of these products, we start off with, looking at, Everrun MX Enterprise, and obviously this is going to provide that highest level of protection for the customer just by itself. Not to mention if you start adding some of the additional pieces that Marathon provides. However, when you look at this, the trade-offs you're making here are obviously from a hardware perspective. The cost of the hardware is going to be a little higher than some of the other solutions, only because of the overhead that's associated with running full system FT. This is not a bad thing. It's simply the way it is. So if you want that level of protection, you need to be able to size your servers. You need to have it in the budget to be able to size the servers to be able to provide you with that level of protection and the level of performance that's required. Obviously, a second server is a requirement for this particular type of product or this level of protection. Additional memory based on the number of PVMs is going to be required. Properly configured machines are going to be required to achieve proper performance. And so we've got an outline in the Marathon hardware guide that will help you help a customer size those machines so that they can understand exactly what the buy is going to be as it relates to the actual requirements from a hardware perspective. What we don't want the customer to do is, ultimately fall in love with a level of protection and then buy a piece of hardware that simply won't provide them with, one, that level of protection, but also that performance that they're looking for. So we want to make sure we're out in front of that as well. Now, the Everrun MX Express configurations, obviously now we start talking about component level FT and some of the risk that's introduced there. Obviously, we've got some significantly reduced hardware requirements, and this is again outlined in the Marathon hardware guide. But if a customer has a budget limit that will not allow them to purchase the servers that are required to do full system FT, we have a solution that's going to offer them a level of redundancy. There will be a second server required for this as well, but we're lowering the processor overhead and memory overhead. Typically, you can get into a server that's going to support this type of configuration in the $2,500 to $3,000 range per server, and there'll be two required. So, if the customer has that sort of amounts of dollars in the budget combined with the software costs, then we've got a solution for them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Everrun monitor piece, as an add-on to either of these, is simply going to enhance the overall availability solution. However, if the customer is simply reluctant to purchase or simply doesn't have in the budget a second server, we want to make sure that we're providing them with some level of protection. So we want to give them something that they can install that will help them manage availability in a proactive manner, and that becomes the Everrun monitor in a standalone server environment situation. And so, being able to lay Everrun monitor on whatever the customer decides to do in terms of providing high availability for their application is going to add that element of proactive availability management and really give them a flavor for the amount of value that Marathon can bring with one of their solutions. And then ultimately, if they decide down the road to add either MX Express or MX Enterprise, or if they've got a DR requirement to add Extend, that's all a conversation that you're able to have with them down the road in terms of upgrading. The availability add-ons, and I know that we've talked a little bit about this in terms of the initial slide that I put up here, but talking about MX Split Site for a moment, just to sort of, and I've got a couple of slides that are going to help everyone understand the difference between a split site implementation and an Extend implementation. But when we think about split site as an availability add-on, we really need to think about reducing risk. So, there's obviously a risk that's associated with buying a fault-tolerant solution and putting both servers in the same data center. Obviously, the risks that are introduced there are mainly environmental, whether it be a power failure or a cooling unit that fails and ultimately causes the overheat in the data center and servers begin to shut down. Though that level of or that type of environmental impact is not something that MX by itself with the servers in the same room will protect you from. However, if you add the element of split site and ultimately go through the process of separating those fault-tolerant assets, so putting one server in building A and one server in building C, and then ultimately routing the availability links over a private network, you're now able to go ahead and if you have a cooling unit that fails in building A and it results in a data center shutdown or servers starting to overheat and shut down, your server in building C will continue to function and continue to run your protected workload. This obviously differs from Extend in terms of the nature of the replication and the requirements, as we're going to go through in just a moment. This allows you to maintain full system fault tolerance or component fault tolerance. So as an overlay to MX or MX Express, and do that in a synchronous nature. So it's really about the type of replication that's being done. As we move down to MX Extend, this is where we start getting into the asynchronous replication and adding a disaster recovery element to this. And this is if you're running, say, an MX, either MX with or without split site, and you want to replicate data to a site that is either 2 states over, 10 states over, across the country, across the world. As long as you have some level of connectivity between these 2 sites, Extend will allow you to asynchronously replicate data for the purposes of disaster recovery. And it will work in just about any situation. Really, the bandwidth and latency there is really only going to impact your recovery point objective. So this system can be configured so that it will function even with low bandwidth, high latency type of connectivity. ultimately what will happen is you'll have to adjust expectations around your recovery point objective to make sure that because data is obviously not going to get across the wire as fast, but you certainly can make those adjustments and make sure that you've got a situation where you've got replicated data across a long, thin pipe if need be. And then ultimately, looking at Everrun Monitor as an availability add-on to either a split site implementation, an extend implementation, a local configuration of MX or a local configuration of MX Express, adding proactive availability management, adding the ability to work in any infrastructure. So if you want to go ahead and add proactive availability management to a customer's VMware environment, we're able to go ahead and pull that in and actually touch that environment as well. And provides visibility in the software, hardware, and the networking stack. So we're really expanding our reach as it relates to managing availability out to all the various components, both inside the PVM and then outside of the ecosystem, to make sure that we're looking at all of the various elements. And that includes things like edge devices, door panels, tags, IP-based security cameras. All of those pieces can be monitored as well to really create a complete solution. Now, in the next two slides, guys, before I sort of wrap up and take any questions that you guys might have, I want to talk a little bit about split site and make sure that we sort of review the what it is and sort of how it works. I'm going to do the same thing with extend. When you think about split site, I want you to think about this in terms of separating your MX assets. So you've got a two-host pool that you're going to run as a redundant solution. Whether you're running MX Enterprise or MX Express, you want to be able to separate these servers. And so ultimately, you're going to have a location 1, as you see here in the slide, with MX host 1, location 2 with MX host 2. And then ultimately, you're going to introduce the concept of a quorum service. And so what quorum service is a simple, lightweight service that can be run on either a standalone machine or another server that's in your environment. But the reason quorum is so important and is actually a requirement for split site is the insulation of risk against split brain. If you don't have a quorum service set up and the link between the two MX hosts is cut, you could potentially wind up with a split brain situation where you have updates being made to one host, updates being made to another host, and there's no synchronization there and no tracking of changes that have been made. That is what we refer to as a split brain scenario, and it's a catastrophic problem. So ultimately what we've done here is introduced a lightweight quorum service that, again, can be run somewhere else in your network. The only requirement is that it be on the same network that you're running your availability links over. And ultimately, you'd have a primary quorum service and an alternate quorum service to insulate yourself from, again, any potential catastrophic problem. Now, in terms of the requirements for split site, and this is really where split site differs from extend in terms of the way you want to look at implementing this. To get a Everrun MX Enterprise protected virtual machine or a level 3 protected virtual machine running with split site, you need to have a gigabit of bandwidth per virtual machine. So when you add up the bandwidth that's available between the two locations, you'll need 1 gig per virtual machine, and you need to be able to accomplish 2 millisecond round trip latency times, so 2 millisecond round trip ping times. That's for a level 3 FTSMP protected virtual machine or an MX Enterprise protected virtual machine. Now, to run split site with Express, that obviously those requirements go down quite a bit. So with Express, you're looking at only requiring 155 megabits of bandwidth per protected virtual machine, and we lighten up the round trip latency requirements to 10 milliseconds. So depending on the infrastructure that your customer has, and their desire or requirement for something like split site in a campus type of setting, you can sort of drive that based on what they have available to them for bandwidth and the type of networking they have between the two sites in order to be able to determine whether or not you can do a level 3 or a level 2 or an express protected virtual machine. And if they want level 3 and don't have that sort of the pieces between that, the network infrastructure to go ahead and accomplish that. There's always a trade-off that can be made there, either by implementing Express and compromising to a level 2, or running level 3 and using Extend to go ahead and do the asynchronous replication, which we'll talk about next. Now, Extend is going to take that Everrun MX environment, whether it be MX Express, MX Enterprise, and it can be run in a split site or in a local configuration. But what Extend is going to do is deploy agents inside of each one of those protected virtual machines and then asynchronously replicate the data to a second site. Now, that second site could be the next building over. It could be 3 miles down the road. It could be 3,000 miles across the country. Because the replication is asynchronous in nature, the only thing that's impacted by low bandwidth, high latency networking is the recovery point objective. So data is going to queue up on the primary site with a slower network connection and take longer to get to the secondary site. So your risk in terms of setting an expectation around the recovery point objective goes up when you have a slower, higher latency network link between the two sites. But certainly this will work in any network infrastructure. And obviously what you then create is a primary path to your applications, which is going to be running on your Everrun MX implementation, and then a failover path to those applications, which is going to be at your secondary site, which is data is going to be asynchronously replicated, and there are a number of different failover scenarios that can take place as it relates to that. So it's a very, very straightforward situation here in terms of an understanding from a customer perspective. But I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page in terms of where you might use split site, where you might use Extend, how to apply the right technology to meet the proper requirement. The same goes for, sort of looking at the mix of MX Express versus MX Enterprise versus Monitor, and really be able to fit a Marathon solution into a customer's environment, regardless of what they're looking at in terms of, an overall budget and availability requirement. So, guys, with that said, I actually am at the end of my presentation. And as I had indicated, I'm going to be making these slides available to you via the partner portal. I'm actually recording this session as well. So within 48 hours, this will be up on our YouTube channel, and you guys will get a link to that, this presentation as well. But I want to pause for a minute and take any questions that you guys might have. And I don't know that there are a lot of questions, because most of the names that I see in here are familiar names to me, so I'm certain that you understand our portfolio. Hopefully this gives you a sort of fresh perspective in terms of positioning this with your customers. One of the questions just came in here that asking if we can use both a split site and an Extend overlay in the same deployment, and the answer there is yes. So if the customer has, from a local, from the primary location perspective, a requirement to separate these assets, because they don't want the risk that's associated with a environmental problem in one of their data centers, they could implement split site while asynchronously replicating data using Extend. So they can use both solutions or both pieces of technology, side by side to be able to go ahead and accomplish that. The next question here, let's see if I've got another one. Can I use Monitor to enhance the availability of a split site implementation? Yes, you can. So again, if you think about what Monitor is going to go ahead and lay on top of your MX implementation, regardless of how you've set it up, whether you've set it up with split site or you've set it up with Extend for DR. Monitor in a split site example will reach out to and monitor the existence of the quorum services to make sure that quorum services remain available. In an Extend environment, it will go out and make sure that your endpoint, as it relates to the DR aspect of this thing, so your failover server or your recovery server remains available, the recovery VM that you've set up remains available. So that can all happen without issue. The next question I have here is, can Everrun Monitor be used to monitor all endpoints? The assumption I'm going to make here when you ask about all endpoints is client-side machines, along with things like cameras or door panels. The bottom line with monitor is as long as it has an IP address, we can monitor it. So if it has an IP address, we have got some level of monitoring that we can do. Now, the levels of monitoring we can do depend greatly on whether or not we can deploy an agent, or whether or not the device is going to be pingable from the monitoring server, or whether the device supports SNMP trap messaging. So all of those are a factor. But yes, we can monitor any endpoint that has an IP address in some way, shape, or form to help the customer enhance the overall availability of the solution. Guys, I don't see any other questions here. So, and given that we're right at around 30 minutes, I want to go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank everybody for sitting with me today and actually walking through the product portfolio. You're going to get an email that thanks you for coming to the session. If you have any additional follow-up questions or you want to discuss this in a little bit more detail, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to jump on the phone and chat with you at any time. Again, we really appreciate all of your support, and we really appreciate everything that you do for us in terms of positioning our solutions with customers. Hopefully, we've been able to provide a fairly fresh perspective in terms of what we're able to do.